Greetings. I'm Kathleen Moriarty, and I'm excited to be here with you at this FutureCon hybrid event on transforming information security and talk about how we can actually do that and why now is an important time to think about this transformation and to work together to make it happen. So with that, if I could have the first slide, please. I'm going to begin with the threat landscape. I think we're all aware of the current threat landscape. Ransomware attacks are happening daily. They're using similar tactics as more advanced, sophisticated, or thought to be sophisticated attacks from threat actors, where they're coming in with email as a hook or other malware to gain hold within your network. The objectives are different because the threat actors do have different objectives, right? And so with ransomware, it's after monetary gain, and they might go after anyone. It might be a small business, it might be a large business, and the goal is monetary gain. For zero-day threats, we might see those from a nation-state threat actor, and those vary also in terms of the ultimate objective, depending on who the threat actor is. And this is important because we often end our investigation on action on objectives with the kill chain or the MITRE ATT&CK framework. But as a business, we have to be concerned with what might happen with our data. And so ransomware, it's exploitation, it's monetary gain, but other nation-state threat actors, it's potentially for other reasons. Now, let's say, look back to SolarWinds, for instance. This was a very creative attack. New techniques were used in that an engineer was embedded into the fold of the team, and nobody saw this. No risk assessment signaled that this could be a problem, and no one pulled out of that product or notified or alerted to this being a potential issue. So they found a new way to get in. Thousands of organizations were hit, but several were targeted specifically where they had data exfiltrated. What do we know from Russian threat actors? They're often seeking to sow discord, to sow divide between people of a nation. And so that data is likely going to be used with that objective in mind. If we go back a decade to when advanced persistent threat attacks began, there were clear objectives from, at the time, the Chinese threat actors who were stealing intellectual property and using it for advancement, technological gains, and economic gains to become more on par with other nations and to use their engineering expertise and to gain that level. Iran, we see patterns of revenge. We see patterns of reuse as well. So that's where I have the day one exploits listed. And we saw that in 2020 with exploitation from Iran of VPN concentrators. It was a great time to exploit VPN concentrators. There was vulnerabilities that were announced, and it's really difficult to take those down, patch, and get them back up online without having downtime for your users. And that was a critical time where that really wasn't possible. And we needed to plan ahead for them. So when a vulnerability was announced, there was a window for exploitation. And so those were often in response to sanctions, and that trend continues. So these are some important things to consider with the threat landscape. Beyond you're attacked, you need to recover, but what might happen with your data? What's the objective of the attacker, and what might you expect after you've cleaned up? We also have some other important changes happening right now, and these are changes with every layer of the protocol stack. And this is a result of a push for strong encryption. So strong encryption baked into our transport protocols is really important. It supports zero trust principles. It's in response to events that happened in 2013 to prevent pervasive monitoring, to target, right? So that anyone looking to uncover what was happening in a particular session had to target their resources to look at those specific sessions. This trend benefits the zero trust push, but it also changes how we can do security going forward. The change in itself puts security management at the endpoint, which at first glance seems to be something that would just increase the number of security professionals what we might need for management. But as I go through this talk, I'm going to walk you through some opportunities that we could use this shift to change our patterns of management. And that's how we can transform security so that it is manageable for businesses of all sizes. So if we could go to the next slide, please. In terms of motivation, they're manyfold at the moment. We have directives from the we have directives from the United States government on the executive order, and executive order, I think it's 14028, where the federal government is pushing for security built in by design and by default. This is really important. This is a big push towards zero trust, towards moving to allow listing, where our systems and our applications only do what's expected of them. And the federal government agencies at a certain point in time in the coming year or so will begin to push this objective, and vendors who sell to them have to comply. So this pushes our vendors, who others of us consume from, towards this model that does scale better. We also have the attack surface that was mentioned previously. At the same time of SolarWinds, several other large vendors were similarly hit in their development environments. It wasn't covered on the news as much. There were some RSA talks that covered it, but there's some important outcomes of those events. And I've heard separately from two very large vendors that when they went to recover their environment, because of the guidance where you should rebuild all of your systems and begin anew, they took a step back and they said, wait a second, this doesn't scale. We can't touch every single box. We can't do all the things that we're supposed to do because the effort is just too large. So we need to change how we manage our development environments and really our network architecture and our other systems, so that we are more resilient, so that we can recover more quickly, and that we don't have to touch each box. Now, hopefully in time, this will translate to how these services are provided for customers. This is a really important consideration, because if these large vendors with resources can't do it, how can the rest of us? So let's move on to the next slide. And I hope that sets the groundwork for some of the motivators in place. Now, what I have up here is a typical enterprise network. You buy your business-focused applications, and then your compensating controls. To manage a network securely today, it's not just managing your business applications. You need to layer on a firewall, an intrusion prevention system. Your firewall might have deep packet inspection. You might deploy web or URL screening or some DNS black holing service. You might do mail screening. And then on top of that, you take all of your logs for your security tools and you digest them and you process them. And they go into both your ticketing systems to remediate from any possible harm that's happened, as well as to your governance, risk, and compliance systems, so that you can keep track of what your current state is. On top of that, many of you have threat feeds. So I am curious, in the chat or through other features for collaboration, how many of you have threat feeds, and how many threat feeds do you have? Well, most organizations don't have just one. They have upwards, 5 and upwards, because they're afraid if one of those threat feeds misses a particular indicator of compromise, they might miss that indicator of compromise completely. So with that, the management of your network requires typically a person behind each of these additional security management devices. And from the beginning, at least when I began work in 1995, I was at a commercial internet service provider. And at the time, not many organizations were online. And those that were had highly technical staff on board that would help with their infrastructure. And we all wanted full transparency, and we still do. We need full transparency so that our auditors can assure that our networks meet the policies and requirements for compliance that we are intended to meet for whatever regulations we have to comply with. Additionally, we wanted full configurability because we were all very technical. That's not the case, though, as we have deployed further out to small and medium-sized businesses. And at Center for Internet Security, I'm the CTO there. We support state, local, tribal, and territorial organizations, many of which who are cyber underserved. They cannot hire the resources needed to manage their environments. They do not have the resources. But yet we've put forth this expectation of having a multitude of staff to manage security properly in your environment. So if you can go to the next slide, please. If you think about this at scale, one organization has a person, a full-time employee behind each of these various security tools. Multiply that by millions. This is why we have a security professional resource deficit at the moment. In the United States, it's clocked in at about 700,000 people. That basically there is a gap and there are openings for those to fill a position for cybersecurity. Organizations can't find qualified people. And this expectation of how we manage security, that it's not done at scale, is really to blame. Now, that number does not account for positions not posted, for organizations who do not have enough resources to hire another person, financial or otherwise. So I'd like you to just ponder that in terms of how did we get here? Why do we have a deficit? And then we can work towards, in this talk, how do we get out of it? Next slide, please. Architectural patterns that scale. This is something I've thought quite a bit about, and the architectural patterns that scale are where we have a vendor or a small group of experts having a very large impact. Right now, we have an expectation that security management is distributed, that each organization is responsible for all of the security management of their enterprise. And this puts some products out of reach. Let's say posture assessment, for instance. If each organization is expected to manage to policies for their organization and then to implement these customized policies that are individual to your organization, the tools available today are complex and require a high degree of skill. What if we push some of that back? A great model for that is the boot process. Many of you may be unaware, and quite honestly, we should be unaware of much of the security that's built into systems, but just about every system you receive today has a secure boot process that relies on a couple of hardware components that are really important, that provide a root of trust for your system. And what happens is, as you boot up your system, there's an expected set of values that have to be matched. The system will take note of measurements and policy settings, including a hash of the firmware and other properties that are compared against the expected values. If there's a mismatch, a process is restarted until you can boot as a secure process. How do you know that that's working? Well, if you're running on a Windows system, you're prompted with your BitLocker password to unlock your system and to decrypt your disk. Now, if you're on a Mac or other system, you can use your fingerprint reader. You can use security-related functions that have cryptographic requirements, and that will tell you that secure boot process happened. That's all hidden, right? The vendor took care of that at scale for the millions of deployed laptops. You just have to enable it, or in some cases, it comes on by default more and more. And that's more of a general push. In other areas, a great example is the manufacturer usage description, otherwise known as MUD. This was built out for the Internet of Things space. And it's an example I really appreciate because the engineers behind it we're thinking of the billions of devices. And when you're thinking about that level of scale, I think it's easier to overcome some of the hurdles that we have with wanting to manage our own systems tightly, because it's just not feasible when you get to the billions of systems that you're talking about for IoT. So what does it do? There is a file, if you've used like IP filters, it's similar to an IP filter type file where you can set forth what are the expected ports and protocols for that IoT devices. What are the expected communications? What are the expected behaviors of the device? Is it on for short periods of time? Does it have Bluetooth low energy, so you're going to have a different pattern from something that's always connected. And by mapping out those patterns and setting that expectation on the device, the vendor is pushing that out to all devices. It's not expected that each organization would do that. Then let's say the vendor of this IoT device experiences some kind of known vulnerability in their software, but they know the firmware won't get updated readily on every single system. What can they do? They can update the MUD file for any known exploits to detect and prevent them, giving you a little bit more time to patch or upgrade your system. This is powerful because it's a small group of experts that can have a very, very large impact. They make an update and it goes out to the billions of devices instead of the expectation that every single organization has somebody to do that. These patterns, and there's a number of them that came to mind as I wrote a book a few years ago on transforming information security. And this came out of working as an IETF area director for 4 years, from 2014 to 2018, observing all of the standards published in that time. So this was 400 pages of reading every other week. And not only observing which standards were going to become mainstream in a few years, but who is authoring them? What might we see going forward, and how can we change it to better environments? Key thing that came forward was that we really have to start to think about architectural patterns that scale. So next slide, please. Yes. Okay, that's a very specific question. I'm going to go on, and if I could address that at the end, that would be great. So with this, there's some trends that we mentioned in the beginning. To embrace those trends could be disruptive, and they will be, right? Because this means eliminating some middle box products, which is going to happen anyway with this trend for strong encryption as it's continued in its deployment. But it would lead to built-in or intrinsic security. In some cases, this will be a choice. What product will you choose? Will you choose the product that has the security built in that might scale better for your environment? Or will you choose the product that might better meet your needs because it has more fuller functionality and you have the staff to support the compensating controls? So that's just something to think about. But I do firmly think there'll be a couple of markets, one that will better support the small and medium businesses, and that you have the opportunity right now in some products to choose the one that is more tightly managed by the vendor and has a lower need of compensating controls. So next slide, please. Great. So I think that question was on the CIS critical security controls. So this might be a good slide to try to address it. And the CIS provides a number of free products for organizations. We are a nonprofit, a trusted entity, and with that, part of our mission and goal is to enable security for the internet, right? The internet, the global internet, a more secure place. The CIS benchmarks offers an opportunity to build that security into every single product. And this scales in a few ways. We have consensus-based experts that volunteer their time and help to build each of the benchmarks so that others, either at an organization, can use that benchmark and make decisions on how they secure their products, or they can buy some products that have the benchmarks already built in. CIS controls similarly go through an expert consensus-based process in their development and offer prescriptive, prioritized, simplified set of security best practices. And what differentiates these is that we have implementation groups. The first implementation group, Group 1, addresses the 5 most common threats seen on the internet. And this is reprioritized on I guess about a annual or year and a half basis, where they go through and they collect all of the threat information from the major threat vendors. So your Verizon DBIR report, Dell SecureWorks, Mandiant, all of the major, as well as the MSISAC data. And so we're actually able to provide this view mapped of the CIS controls into the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and then the normalization of all of that rich data from the threat providers, so you get a real idea of what can you do to target the biggest threats that are seen today. And this might be something used to justify to your board. And why does this scale? You have a small set of experts having this large impact. And then on top of that, it is built into some products. Now for the question on, I think it was just mapping to a very specific CIS control 18, I think it was, to the zero trust maturity model. So I'd actually need a reminder of what control 18 itself was. That is, and then I would be able to map that into the maturity model. So if the follow-up, if you have that in front of you and can just put in what control 18 is, I could do that off the bat. I also have a blog that's posted on CyberSecurity that does a mapping between all of the CIS critical security controls and zero trust. And it also taps into the Lockheed Martin kill chain to show why zero trust is important, and walks through the relationship. And zero trust basically came out about the same. Okay. Okay, so all right. Thank you. So with penetration testing, I would put that into, gosh, I would think about NIST 800-207 and the tenets of zero trust and the overarching requirement for logging. Now, the ZT maturity model, that's from CISA, and that has pillars where you're thinking about, your network, your identity, your data as separate initiatives where you're working towards each of those goals, but you're instilling those tenets from NIST 800-207 within each of those pillars. So it's really a cross section in how you would get to a mapping from the penetration testing to the ZT maturity model, with the intersection of NIST special publication 800-207 that has logging as a key piece, which feeds into your detection capability. Because if you remember, with zero trust, you're putting up more gates. You're putting up more places to detect and to prevent an attack from escalating in its place in the network. So that's how you might tie in the MITRE ATT&CK framework or the Lockheed Martin kill chain. You want to detect an attack as early as possible in the kill chain to prevent as much damage. You don't want something like lateral movement to happen or data exfiltration. And so if you have, penetration in use, penetration testing in use, you can find the vulnerabilities in your network and close them off more readily, and be more familiar with any alerts that you'll see that come in as part of that tenet for zero trust, really. So it maps more to the 800-207 which is a layer on each of those CISA pillars. So I hope that helps. All right, so I'll go on to the next slide. Okay, great. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the, I mentioned the boot process before, and it relies on a couple of hardware security components. And this is really important because this is part of the timing that we're in industry, where we can see some real change. We can change how we're doing some of the automation, and we can shift it to the vendor. And these two components are going to play a large role. We're already seeing that take place. And so these are used in that boot process mentioned before, where you do that check that my firmware, my BIOS meets everything expected of it. And so there's a handoff that the OS will boot. I can unlock my data and I can operate because I know my base is trusted. Could there be a problem with that? Of course, there could be a problem with anything. But we have systems in place to update, patch, revise, and we have to rely on that. But this gets us a lot better. It moves us towards automation. It moves us towards more possible shifts of the vendor taking more responsibility, which is essential because people are drowning in the current set of requirements. So why now, right? You've probably heard about these, the trusted platform module and the trusted execution environments for at least the last 20 years, some of you. And they didn't always work. They took a really long time to work. The TPM, for instance, really wasn't functional, and people, were thinking it just wasn't going to work until just a few years ago when TPM 2.0 was ratified as a standard in the 2015-2016 time period. Once that was ratified as a standard, chips were burned to those specifications. Vendors began to put them onto their boxes. In some cases, it's on every board, even if it's not in use. So if a system has multiple boards, it might be relying on one of them, but there's other ones sitting there. This practice of including this chip that was intended to cost $1 really took off in that time frame. And now we're in 2023. So if you think about the average life cycle of equipment, and the ranges that I found looking are between 3 to 6 years, and sometimes longer, of course. But in that time frame, we've passed that time frame, and refresh cycles should have most systems having that TPM. The TEE timeline is a little bit different. We did have TEEs in 2015, 2016, but if you remember, there were these attacks called Spectre Meltdown. There's a couple of great talks in the 2018 timeframe at RSA conference if you want to learn more about them. Essentially, the trusted execution environment is part of your CPU that provides isolated execution. So if you're going to do something that needs to be super secure, you execute it within the TEE. And the boot process, when you're verifying that your components and your policy settings are as expected, that happens in the TEE. If you're doing some cryptographic function, that might happen in the TEE as well. Or operating on some data that requires privacy, that might happen in the TEE. So we had this big event in 2018, Spectre Meltdown, and that kind of set us back. And even then I was questioning, well, I guess this isn't all it's cracked up to be because there's side channel attacks. However, even with the side channel attacks, we're a lot better using the TEE than we were previously, and they've been patched. And there's mitigations if there are similar exploits that arise that tap on that speculative execution, for those of you who are more technical. And we patch. This gets us a lot better, though, because we have this chance of isolated execution. The other really interesting thing that happened in 2019 is that we had this group formed called the Confidential Computing Consortium. And they made it easier to program to the different vendors that have a CPU with a trusted execution environment in it. Because the problem was, and still is, if you're using a specific vendor's commands to reach out and program to these devices, it's hard. It's hard. It doesn't always work. And so a few vendors came together, and now it's actually quite large, the Confidential Computing Consortium, to have software that could program to any TEE back to any operating system. So to alleviate that really specific need, and that's going to open up our ability to not just have the boot process covered with this verification. It's called attestation, verification of controls and settings by the vendor, but we can do more. So with that, I'm just going to quickly go through the next two slides, and then I'd love to take questions. So the next two basically shows that my team did some analysis on where the TPM is in systems, and we found near 100% of systems that you purchase today have a TPM included. And next for the TEE, our finding was similar. I think it was like 99%. So we have really good adoption of this, and we'll be publishing a report in the coming months, basically to encourage up the stack use of this so that we can push for automation that happens at the vendor more. We might not get to full automation, but if we could reduce what's required for add-on by building more into products through innovations like this and using architectural patterns at scale, it will go a long way. Next slide, please. Oh, next slide, please. So that's just a couple of the architectural patterns that scale. And in the book I wrote that was published in July of 2020, there are more examples. These aren't all of the examples. This is meant to provide a broad background in security architecture and design, the book, as well as to get you thinking about architectural patterns that scale so that you might come up with your own, and to really think about how can we make security more manageable? How can we as vendors, I'm not a vendor, but how can vendors build it in? But also as a customer, what can you do to request this of your vendor or consider this when you're doing your vendor selection? So those are some of the thoughts I'd like to leave you with, and I'd love to take your questions. Okay, thank you. Well, I'll provide another update too, in case anyone's interested. Another way we're trying to help at Center for Internet Security, and would love your ideas, is that my team worked with industry experts over the last year and a half to develop guidance for IoT vendors to make it easier for them to look for security guidance when making selections as deep as your protocol stack in an IoT device. And so some of the research was that NIST is doing these great efforts on things like labeling, and the data labels is a really great effort. But what if an IoT vendor wants to increase and have their data label look better? Well, they might be able to use our guide to help make better choices of what security options are possible with whatever they chose for the underpinnings of their device. Because we went through and we worked to figure out the popular protocol stack or the underpinnings of your device, and then what are all of the options to secure it. And so that's something we just released last week in an effort to really help with that shift left. So it's a free product. There's no hard requirements in there. It's more of guidance to see if this could be an aid to industry, really to help with shifting things left. And so we're interested to do other similar types of work into the community with consensus guidance along those lines, really to make the internet more secure and to provide resources that should be available but have been difficult. And in this particular case, if every vendor went and did the research that was done to pull together this guide to make decisions, they would be spending many months on that research to draw conclusions. So hopefully the guide will help save them, significant time in their initial research, as well as, any follow-on research And it might help you as a customer or an enterprise if you're evaluating your IoT devices and trying to make decisions. What security can be instilled in particular devices, and what could you ask for if it's not there? So hopefully the guide will serve as an aid in that regard as well. And so that's one of the new products that we've put out. And I recommend taking a look at the website, because we do try to, between all of the different departments at CIS, put out really good resources to help the community, to help those that are cyber underserved, and to really better security for all. Okay, well, in person in Boston, there was a slew of them, so I'm hoping a few of you have some questions. The last FutureCon. Yes, it was an excellent event and a great audience, and I'm sure this is too. Sure, sure. So this is a book I've actually been using with a course I teach at Georgetown. It's a master's level course on security architecture and design. And in writing it, what I found was that resources available on the internet either were not accurate or were just too difficult because it was dispersed. And this consolidates it. It was also written very intently to reach many different audiences. So it's written at a high level, but has pointers to more technical documents for those that want to dive deeper. It covers, hot topics like authentication, which, quite frankly, is a really hard area because of the vast number of protocols and the different design decisions that led to this vast number. So it breaks it down to help you make decisions. It also breaks down things like the overall security management of your program and different control frameworks, as well as questions board of directors should be asking. So, it begins from that high level that could reach a board of director member down to a practitioner that might be advising on solutions, and really cuts across all areas of security architecture and design. So I recommend it, and I'd love your feedback. All right, so we do have a question now. Do you believe TPM, to platform module, and common criteria can become collaborative? Okay, so Elvis, if I go off track because I'm misreading into this, please do provide some follow-up. So the trusted platform module, it's a tiny chip on a board, meant to cost about $1. You can do a quick Google search, and from the Trusted Computing Group, it's very clearly specified what should be in that TPM, and provides, cryptographic capabilities so that you can digitally sign evidence on your system and have an assurance that it was signed by that module. And common criteria sets forth standards that you would meet. So I think the common criteria could use the TPM in its requirements, right? That you have an assurance that there is a root of trust on different, policy or prescriptive guidance, similar to it could be used with CIS benchmarks. But I don't know if I'm hitting on your question or there's another nuance. So please do follow up if I'm missing a nuance. What was that? Ah, great. Yes. Yeah, it's a chip that costs $1, right? So it was meant to be um, on every board, really easy to get out there. and to provide a high level of security for your system. So really interesting that we were able to do that at, a low cost so that it could be ubiquitous, and that has happened. Oh, great. Thank you. So a little bit more on the book while we wait for that. It does go into some of the trends and directions on um, posture assessment and remediation, as well as other areas where we can institute different architectural patterns that scale, just to give you more ideas. It goes into operating systems and all sorts of selections that you might make in the design process for your organization, and the application protocol flows for vendor risk assessments, and those types of topic areas are covered. It's fairly comprehensive and short. It's not a long book, but covers quite a bit. Can you pop that back up, Mike? I had started speaking before the question popped up, so I figured I'd finish. Since Common Criteria is an IT product security certification, could it use TPM standards to help with Common Criteria certifications? Yes. Yeah. So there's a technology called attestation. I briefly mentioned it just because it is highly technical and confusing, right? So the one thing I find with attestation where people get confused is that when you have an auditor come in and physically conduct an audit, might use some manual and automated controls in your environment. They provide an attestation that your policy is met, right? And this is usually an attestation is usually from an auditor. We've repurposed that term, attestation, and what happens is evidence is created on your system, or a policy is set on your system. That is digitally signed. And so these digitally signed. And then in the trusted execution environment, you verify that digital signature on the evidence, so that you know that it was signed by your TPM, and you compare the value of either the measurement or the policy setting against what's expected. If it doesn't match, then there's a problem. So my team is actually doing some research to see what we could do with this in a few places. And so it's in the early days, but there is some promise. And if you look to Microsoft Azure, they have a great page that describes attestation in the way that I've been describing it for several years. So that's tremendous progress to see that pop up in the last couple of months, where, the way it's talked about in the book from a couple of years ago, vendors are starting to think about it up the stack now that we have it at these base layers. So absolutely, you could apply attestation to test settings within Common Criteria. Can you test all of them yet? No. We have some time to go, but this holds promise for the future and how we can set expectations for managing security, how we can build them into business products, and how we can think differently. All right, so it looks like there's some more questions. In recent times, zero trust has become one of the more common vendor buzzwords used in their marketing. Yes, and that's unfortunate. Do you have recommendations on how to cut through the marketing language to determine how vendors can truly provide added services that enable ZT capabilities? So I'd say the first thing is that no one vendor provides zero trust, right? Unless it's baked into the business application. Let's say you're buying a product that is fully hosted. They might claim they provide a fully managed zero trust solution for you. And then you would need to look at their framework, right? Their security control framework of choice, whatever they are audited to. And you'd have to learn how they implement controls to see, are there things like microsegmentation in place? Do they have extreme logging and use of those logs to detect any threats? Or if, between those gates put up by microsegmentation and identity access management and access controls have been flagged, right? So that access is prevented. And so that's the one place where I'd say zero trust might be more fully provided is within a business hosted application. And you absolutely should begin to look for that. There are some vendors who do a great job where and not many, but this will increase in time, but look for the vendors that provide a more full set of security controls where you don't have to add on too much yourself, right? Look at your total costs. Work with your business units who are selecting products to say, okay, I understand you like this product, but let's look at the total compensating controls. Who's the competitor? Now let's weigh out total resources for management against the functionality. And can we get functionality in the one that's more secure that perhaps you didn't think was there in the one that you selected? And those are discussions to have with business units, and I know not easy. So in terms of how to cut through marketing language, I'd go back to NIST 800 special publication, NIST special publication 800-207. Become really familiar with the tenets of zero trust. They are foundational. Everyone points to them. So even though there's lots of different documentation on zero trust, one trend you'll see is everybody points back to that document, and there's a reason it's good, right? It lays out 7 tenets. It talks about strong authentication and dynamic verification of that identity and access control set. So you don't just authenticate once for the user, the application, even the module. It's expected at dynamic time periods. Another one is verification. So this is the posture assessment and remediation piece I'm talking about that really fits nicely into that verification requirement and dynamic verification. So if you think about the boot process has that because it doesn't just work at boot time, it works at runtime to recheck those measurements and policy settings so you know if there's a problem with your system. Encryption. Keep looking for strong encryption, ways to move towards strong encryption. And in transforming information security, I do talk about that quite a bit. How can you embrace this? And the reason I dive into that is because as area director in the IETF from 2014 to 2018, this was post-Snowden, right? That was 2013. And so a lot of the work of that time period was about how do we make encryption stronger and how do we make it ubiquitous. And so this meant we were going to have to adapt. And that was a big part of my thought process in this book. Another thing I had worked on with operators was a survey of what are all the things that are going to be impacted by this push to strong encryption. And it was very controversial at the time. But if you think several steps ahead, it really makes sense. You have to map out all of the things that are going to be impacted because if you don't, you can't figure out how to overcome them. And so that's what the document did. It was a collection from all different types of operators, service provider level, what gets impacted as you move to strong encryption. And the book includes how you get around that and why it's important change. It took me a lot of thinking through the whole process of seeing the hundreds of documents read and the thousands and thousands of pages read, and then that pivotal work of RFC 8404 that collected what are all the things that are going to break. So how do we move forward? And then there was this overlying problem of the security professional deficit, and just hearing many, many people say we can train our way out of it. I just didn't buy that because, as you know, a lot of us think differently, right? Security professionals, we have different thought patterns than a lot of other people. And this helps us be good at what we do. And to some degree, you can train some of that, but not fully. So I think it really set me back to thinking about those architectural patterns and how do we overcome them. So how do we change from the architectural patterns of the past where we had a requirement for full transparency and full configurability everywhere towards maintaining that transparency, but perhaps shifting the configurability so that organizations that don't meet the model of having a ton of resources and never will could have their businesses survive on the internet and not have the expectation of being attacked. So I think I got to all of the tenets: verification, dynamic verification, encryption, logging, authentication and access controls, as well as dynamic authentication. Great. Are you aware of any industry independent certification attestations that can validate an effective zero trust architecture? Not yet, um, but I suspect that will come in time. The ISO 27001, if you're looking at audit results, you might be able to tell if it's meeting those 7 tenets. I think with the publication of the CISA maturity model on zero trust, that will go a long way as well, because they set examples of different levels of maturity and what it looks like for each of the 5 pillars. So they tell you, this is the very basic, the current state network, and this is what it looks like for your data, your network, and the other pillars. But it also tells you what does it look like for that top tier when you have zero trust fully implemented. And so I think we're going to get there. We do have attestations to each of the control frameworks, including the CIS critical security controls, the ISO 27001, NIST 853. So there are accreditations to those. I think it's just a matter of time till we get to the audits that also show a maturity level, right? So the CMMC might do some of that, and that's in an evolution. Okay, great. And pay attention, right? Look to see what you see of vendors, who's being exploited, where there are holes. If they're claiming zero trust, try to look at the track record and see how they claim zero trust and what's baked in. We're going to get there, and I think it's just a matter of making good choices where you can. How can you reduce resources, and asking more of our vendors. So I really appreciate the time today and the opportunity to speak with you. Yeah, thank you, and I welcome follow-up.